Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything, and for any noises in the background while reading this work. This is Chapter 7, Part 2 of Passerine. Same trigger warnings apply and are in the description. That's it? Wilbur glanced up from his instrument with furrowed brows. What do you mean? He asked as he lowered his violin from his chin and gazed at the woman sitting across from him, her heavy skirts spilling around her in a Cheryline tide. She did not meet his confused stare. Her attention was fixed entirely on the easel in front of her, turned slightly away from him, so all he could see were random splotches of color. Paint stained her hands and her hair and her skin. Deep indigos and soft blues and the dark browns of the eyes that were his inheritance from her. Mother considered her canvas in silence for a few seconds before making a gentle stroke with her brush. You stopped playing all of a sudden, she murmured absently. I thought the song was finished. It's not, Wilbur said. Just like your painting isn't either. She shot him a rueful smile. When did you get so cheeky? When you weren't looking, I suppose. He pointed his violin's bow accusingly at her. And I only stopped because you interrupted me. I did not interrupt you. I would never. She tucked a stray hair behind her ear, leaving a golden streak of paint across her cheek in the process, before turning back to her painting. You remember the rules of the art tower, don't you, my boy? Wilbur rolled his eyes affectionately at her. The art tower had been his mother's idea, and her first mistake had been allowing a 10-year-old Wilbur to name it. It was the east tower of the castle, and it was meant to be a place Wilbur could play as loud and as badly as he wanted, and where Mother could accidentally spill jars of paint without ruining some random priceless artifact. A place where stringed instruments hung on the walls instead of morning stars and swords, and worn easels stood in place of suits of armor. It was a tower, and it was full of art. Thus, following young Wilbur's stream of consciousness, the art tower. Older Wilbur would have chosen something a bit more tasteful. He would name it after the massive arched windows in the soft morning light, or the daffodils that grew at the sills, or the white lace curtains dancing in the breeze like the veil of a bride made of air. But it would be the art tower, now and forever. Tommy would never let him live it down. I'm not hearing any music, Mother hummed. Wilbur sighed lovingly as he put the violin back under his chin. The things I do for you, Mother. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as she gave him a dazzling smile. If you finish your song, she said, I'll let you peek at the canvas. That's bribery. You are bribing your son. Your own sweet boy. She tossed her head back in a laugh, brown and gray ringlets falling over her shoulders. Dance for me, my puppet, she chortled. She waggled the fingers that weren't holding the paintbrush in some vague approximation of puppetry. Dance. Wilbur shook his head and raised his eyes to the heavens. All right, he said. From the top, then. He put the bow to the string and began to play again. A shadow fell over Techno as a giggle interrupted the sounds of the forest, chasing the birds back to their nests. Without opening his eyes, Techno said, I know it's you. Another giggle. Quieter this time, as if she were trying to swallow back her childish glee. Papa wants you home, she said cheerfully. You're in big trouble. Sure, Techno drawled sarcastically, and you aren't, a little brat. Hey, that's rude. Papa said you weren't allowed to be rude to me anymore. Techno felt something against his ribs that might have been a kick or a gentle breeze. As he smiled to himself, as he finally cracked one eye open to look at his little sister, she was pouting, arms crossed and brows furrowed, as if she could ever be terrifying to him. She intimidated him as much as a bumblebee drifting drowsily overhead. So close, Techno could reach out and tap it between his cupped hands. But instead, he stayed where he was, arms folded under his head, the grass beneath him as soft as a bed of hay. Papa really does want you home, though, she reiterated, even as she dropped onto the ground beside him and laid her little head against his chest, her twin braids like pink snakes coiling across his torso. Techno leveled his breathing so she could stay lying there peacefully, as if she were a wild animal that could be spooked away with one wrong move. But though she did have some of the wilderness in her, there was no doubt in his mind that she was fearless. 6 years old, and Techno already knew that she would someday rule the world, and he would be the proudest older brother on the face of the earth. Techno, she asked pensively, after a moment of comfortable silence. There was seldom a different kind of silence between the two of them. In a family of loud, loving parents and louder, more annoying siblings, he and his youngest sister had managed to carve out a space for themselves where they did not need to shout to be heard. She was gazing up at the foliage above them, her face dotted with the sunlight that punctured stubbornly through the leaves, unwilling to let their route to the earth be interrupted by anything less than a fellow star child. "Do you ever feel like," she began haltingly, "like your spirit is too big for your own body?" "Nah," Techno replied after serious consideration. "My spirit likes where it is just fine." She rolled over to fix him with her piercing blue eyes, looking annoyed, as if Techno had failed some sort of test he did not even know he was taking. "Well, I feel like that sometimes," she declared imperiously. "How could you not? You're so small. Of course your spirit would want to break out of there. You're suffocating it." "I feel like a frog sometimes, too," she continued, in that nonsensical way that young children often bounce from the heaviest subjects to the lightest without warning or prolonged thought. Techno missed having that kind of power, the power to simply not give a darn. "Mama and I went to the village yesterday, and it rained, so we had to stop under a tree so we wouldn't get wet, and I found 3 frogs running by in the rain. 3 frogs, Techno! Have you ever seen 3 frogs all at once?" "Never," Techno lied easily. "That's the rarest occurrence in the world, I think. As rare as a quadruple rainbow. I think the gods might be sending you a sign." "And the frogs," she barreled on, seeming to give no heed to Techno's reply. "They were just jumping from one puddle to another. Splish, splash, but I don't think they liked any of the puddles because they didn't stay in one for too long. Splish, splash, on to the next adventure." "Adventure, huh?" Techno mused. "To break out for a great big adventure. I don't know what my spirit wants to do when it gets out." When, Techno noted, not if. What she wanted, she would get, and Techno was almost always the instrument for it. "But," she added, getting to her feet, "right now, I think I'd rather not get scolded by Papa, so let's get home." And she smiled, that smile that ran in Techno's family and seemed to find him the only exception. It was a smile, Techno thought, that wars would be fought for. It was a smile that could burn this whole darn forest down. The gods took all the good things they had ever created and stitched it into the corners of that smile. Techno couldn't help but smile back, rougher on the edges and made of meaner stuff. He got to his feet and held out a hand to his sister. She placed her tiny palm in his. It was the most precious thing Techno would ever hold. "Let's go home," he echoed. Philza rolled the apple between his palms, feeling its weight in his hands for a moment before he tossed it into the basket by his feet. Already it was piled high with ruby red fruit, spilling over into the grass below. He stepped back and inhaled deeply, the scent of apple blossoms and spring and life crawling into his lungs and settling there like an animal in hibernation. He could taste the sweetness on his tongue. He could feel the breeze against his skin. The apple orchard was ready for harvest, and everything was all right with the world. "Dad!" Philza turned to watch his son weaving between the trees. He couldn't help the laugh that exploded out of him at the sight of his youngest son's arms piled high with apples, toppling to the ground with every excited step he took. By the time he reached Phil, he only had a handful left with him, the rest leaving a trail of red through the orchard. But he was grinning as if he had accomplished something great. "Best delivery boy in the whole kingdom," Tommy said proudly. "I'm still waiting for that promotion to head apple picker." Philza ruffled his hair affectionately. "He's gotten so tall," Phil thought as the golden strands slipped between his fingers like running water. "You have to beat out the other competition to get that title, Tommy. Can't have people thinking I'm giving you special treatment." "It's only right to give special treatment to your special boy," Tommy declared, rolling the apples into the grass by his feet. "That's nepotism." "No, it's being a good father." Phil's smile faltered, almost infinitesimally, but Tommy caught it anyway. "Hey," he said with a gentler voice than Philza deserved, "is something wrong?" "No," Phil said, feeling fissures form in his chest where his heart used to beat. He took a deep breath, letting the taste of pollen linger on his tongue before he swallowed the bitterness down. "Nothing's wrong, and that's the problem, isn't it?" Tommy stared back at him with soft blue eyes. Someone once told Philza that children were merely reflections of their parents, but he knew that couldn't be true, because every time he looked in the mirror, he only ever saw the worst of himself, all the places he'd abandoned, all the people he'd killed, all the sons he'd left orphaned. But when he looked at Tommy, all he ever saw was proof that the universe still had the capacity for goodness. Tommy really did get a lot taller. In time, he would grow to be even taller than Philza was. If only he hadn't died before he could. There were many things Philza knew that Tommy could never do now. To even have him standing before Philza under the shifting shadows of their kingdom's apple trees was an impossibility. Tommy's brows drew together in confusion as the silence between them stretched on. Philza knew he was only prolonging the inevitable. Just let me stay in this lie, he begged, for 1 second more. A minute passed, 2. Tommy shifted on his feet. Dad? He whispered. Philza sighed, and in a quiet, broken voice he said, This isn't real, is it? Tommy stared at him blankly, and then he began to smile. Follow the breadcrumbs, his little sister said. That's what Papa always says. The path was well worn and cut through the thickest part of the forest. The trees were so close together that the sunlight could no longer pierce through, leaving the two of them walking through the dim with no guide but their hands in each other's, and the memory of their father's murmured words, follow the breadcrumbs. The little things would be the ones that kept them on the right track. A crooked tree, a low-hanging branch with all its leaves plucked off by a passing hand, a pile of rocks by the side of the road that a younger techno had spent 3 bored minutes stacking together, now moss-covered and leaning dangerously to the side, but still standing. Following breadcrumbs through a cold, dank forest with his little sister's hand carried around his finger. This was a route they knew by heart, and a story they lived hundreds of times before. Follow the breadcrumbs, his sister repeated, tightening her grip on Techno, and you'll never get lost. And then, slowly, she began pulling him to the side, heading straight towards the brambles. Techno pulled her back to the road, small feet skidding reluctantly across the dirt. Papa also says to not stray from the path, he reminded her sternly, eyeing the dark trees standing like silent sentinels on either side of them. The path was safe. The path would take them home. Anything else was a dangerous gamble. Though he knew the forest well, it did not know him at all, and gods knew what monsters lurked behind the bushes, waiting for wandering strangers. Keep away from the dark, or the spiders will get you, she finished, and her voice was dead and dull. Techno's heart skipped a beat. He was used to her jumping from one emotion to another, but this was something different, something that was not her at all. Are you all right? He asked worriedly. Yes, she whispered back, as if there was an invisible threat she was careful not to startle. Just tired. Do you want me to carry you on my back? No, she took a deep breath. We always have to be walking side by side. This is how it happened. Confusion and panic wearing inside of him. Techno said, How what happened? She suddenly paused, pulling Techno to a stop with her. She had her eyes fixed straight, looking off towards a horizon Techno couldn't see. There was only the dark, and the weight of her small hand slowly growing colder in his. Techno, she said slowly, quietly. Too unlike the brilliant girl that spoke of souls, and adventures, and frogs in the rain just a few hours, days, years, eons ago. Techno, she repeated firmly, turning towards him with wide, fearful eyes. Techno, what's my name? Techno opened his mouth to answer, but silence was his only reply. You've stopped again. Wilbur slowly lowered his bow, looking around the tower with a growing sense of unease. He did not remember learning the song he'd been playing for his mother. Did he write it himself? Was it a ballad from some long-dead composer? Still thinking about the unfamiliar tune, Wilbur walked silently towards the table in the corner, where the silk-lined case for his violin stood open and waiting. He placed the instrument gently inside and snapped the case shut. For a moment, his fingers lingered on the gold clasps. I don't even play the violin. He turned towards his mother, who continued painting as if nothing had happened, lost in her colors. Mother, Wilbur called. Mama? She paused, then gestured him over. Come look at this, Will. Wilbur made his way over to her, stopping just behind her and placing his hands on her shoulders as he leaned in to look at her work. There was a painting hanging in the hallway downstairs that Wilbur walked under at least 12 times a day. It was the official family portrait, done by their court painter, when Tommy was just a toddler and slept soundly through everything. Wilbur had always hated it. They'd all looked so stiff and serious in it, and Wilbur could still remember the horrid pins and needles he acquired from sitting on the floor for hours on end. And his mother, in response, had made it beautiful. She'd used brighter colors, softer colors, turning the dark, somber shades into something that felt more alive. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. Still seated on a simple throne was Mother herself, but with more gray in her pinned-up hair. Behind her, a hand on her shoulder, was Father. He stood with his blue eyes lit up with pride, the only signs of his age in the laugh lines forming at his temples as he smiled back at Wilbur from the canvas. And then, drawing all attention inevitably to him, there was Tommy, leaning against the arm of his mother's chair. He was older, too, with longer hair curling over his ears and shoulders, but the traces of his childhood remained in the wolfish grin and the cocky quirk of his eyebrow. Before Wilbur could think better of himself, he reached out to run his fingers along the painted lines of his brother's face. Fortunately, the paint had already dried, and Wilbur was free to trace the gentle curls of Tommy's hair. Then, slowly, Wilbur's hand drifted towards the floor, where he had been sitting in the original painting. He wondered how Mother made him beautiful, if that was at all possible in the first place. He wondered how the years had made their mark on him. But instead of paint, there was only pencil marks where Wilbur was supposed to be, vaguely in the shapes of a person, a sketch. He looked down at his mother, and she turned in her seat to look at him with a sad smile. "You're not done yet," she whispered, raising her hand to cup his cheeks and gently wipe away the single tear that had escaped without his notice. "I ruin it," he sobbed. "I'm sorry." "No, darling, that's not what I meant at all." She got up from her seat and wrapped her arms around Wilbur. Wilbur had to duck his head to bury his face into her shoulders. Trembling with grief he could not name, his mother held him like he was a child again, seeking comfort from nightmares. "You have ruined nothing. You are the greatest gift of my life, Wilbur, but I do not want you here." He pulled back with tear-stained cheeks, unable to fit enough air into his heavy lungs. "Here?" he asked. "Where is here?" "The art tower," she replied simply, "and everywhere, and nowhere." And Wilbur remembered.